There are roads in history where the landscape remembers what the world forgot. This is one of them. On October 14th, 1944, on a quiet German countryside road that looks like any other, one of the war's greatest commanders spent his final 15 minutes alive. Not in battle, but in the back seat of a staff car, holding a cyanide capsule that represented Adolf Hitler's final message. What was said to Rommel before he died? And why did Hitler need to kill the very general he had once called Germany's greatest warrior? There is a road in southern Germany that looks like any other. No monuments line the pathway. No tourists stop to take photographs. No bronze plaques mark what happened here. But on October 14th, 1944, this quiet stretch of countryside became the final battleground for one of the Second World War's most celebrated commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself. He did not fall to enemy bullets. He was not captured by advancing Allied forces. He was killed by the regime he had served with legendary skill and unwavering devotion. And before he died, a message was delivered in Adolf Hitler's name, words that transformed Germany's most famous general into a condemned man in less than an hour. Pause for impact. Before we understand what was said to Rommel that sealed his fate, we need to go back just a few months, to the moment when being Hitler's favorite general became the most dangerous position in all of Germany. By autumn 1944, Rommel was no longer just a military problem for the Nazi leadership. He had become a political one. After his defensive campaigns in France, Rommel had seen what Hitler refused to accept. The war could not be won. He spoke too openly about negotiating peace. He questioned orders too publicly. And then came July 20th, the failed assassination attempt that unleashed Hitler's paranoid fury across the entire German command structure. Rommel's name surfaced in the investigations, not as a bomb plotter, but as a man who knew too much, who questioned too loudly, whose popularity with the German people made him impossible to quietly arrest. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. Hitler made his decision, but it would not be the kind of justice anyone expected. On the morning of October 14th, two generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen, where he was still recovering from head injuries sustained months earlier in Normandy. They did not come with handcuffs. They did not come with arrest warrants. They came with an ultimatum delivered in Hitler's name. Option 1. Take a cyanide capsule immediately. Your family will be protected. Your reputation will remain intact. You will receive a state funeral with full military honors as a war hero. Option 2. Refuse and be transported to Berlin to stand trial as a traitor. The verdict was already decided. Execution was guaranteed, and your wife and son would suffer the consequences of being the family of a condemned man. This was not mercy. This was control masquerading as choice. Rommel asked for time to speak with his family. He told his wife the truth. Then he turned to his teenage son and spoke words that would echo through history. I will be dead within 15 minutes. Rommel's son, Manfred, asked if they could resist, if loyal soldiers might defend them. Rommel answered quietly that there was no point. One life, he said, was better than many. SS units had already surrounded the area. Snipers were positioned. This was not a negotiation. It was an execution with conditions. Rommel put on his uniform one final time. He shook hands with his family, and he walked out of his home knowing he would never return. He entered a staff car with the two generals, Mazel and Bergdorf, and they drove only a short distance from his villa, just far enough to be out of sight. The car stopped on this quiet country road. General Mazel and the SS driver were ordered out of the vehicle. They walked a short distance away. General Bergdorf remained in the back seat with Erwin Rommel. Rommel held the cyanide capsule. Hitler's final command, made physical. No last speech was recorded. No witnesses were allowed to speak freely. Within minutes of biting down on the capsule, the desert fox was gone. Not as a rebel, not as a traitor, but as a man erased for knowing too much. Shortly after, Bergdorf stepped out of the car and signaled the others to return. They drove away, with Rommel's body slumped in the back seat. And the machinery of the lie immediately began to turn. Today, a small memorial marks this spot. The inscription reads that Rommel chose free death, Freitod, sacrificing himself to protect his family from Hitler's punishment. But the truth is more complex than even this stone suggests. Because what Hitler told Rommel, without ever speaking to him directly, was not just a death sentence. It was a message about the nature of absolute power. That loyalty offers no protection. That greatness provides no shield. And that in a dictatorship, even legends can be erased in 15 minutes. To understand how Germany's most famous general ended up on this road, we need to go back to the beginning, to the rise of the Desert Fox, and the moment when Adolf Hitler made Erwin Rommel into a legend he would later need to destroy. Erwin Rommel was not born into military aristocracy. He did not come from Prussian nobility or inherit his rank through family connections. He earned it. Born in 1891 in southern Germany, Rommel joined the army as a young officer and quickly distinguished himself not through political maneuvering, but through something far more valuable on the battlefield: tactical brilliance and personal courage. During World War I, Rommel fought in France, Romania, and most famously in Italy, where his daring mountain warfare tactics at the Battle of Caporetto earned him Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite. He led from the front. He studied terrain like a chess master studies the board. And he understood something that many officers of his generation did not: that speed, surprise, and audacity could overcome superior numbers. These lessons would define his career. Between the wars, Rommel became an instructor, teaching infantry tactics and writing a book on military strategy that would later catch the attention of someone who would change his life forever: Adolf Hitler. When World War II began, Rommel commanded a panzer division during the invasion of France in 1940, while other commanders followed cautious, methodical plans. Rommel pushed forward with aggressive speed, often racing ahead of his own supply lines. His division reached the English Channel before anyone expected, helping to trap Allied forces at Dunkirk. Hitler noticed. And in early 1941, when Germany needed someone to save its struggling Italian allies in North Africa, Hitler personally chose Rommel to lead the newly formed Africa Corps. This is where the legend was born. North Africa became Rommel's stage, a vast desert theater where traditional European warfare rules did not apply. Here, mobility mattered more than numbers. Deception mattered more than firepower. And Rommel excelled at both. He would attack when logic said he should defend. He would retreat when his enemies expected him to stand. He used dummy tanks to create phantom divisions. He led reconnaissance missions himself, often appearing in the front lines when British commanders thought he was miles behind. The British called him the Desert Fox, a nickname that combined respect with grudging admiration. Even Winston Churchill, whose forces Rommel repeatedly outmaneuvered, once said in Parliament, "We have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and, may I say across the havoc of war, a great general. It was almost unheard of. A wartime leader praising an enemy commander while the war still raged. But Rommel had earned something rare in war: the respect of those trying to kill him. Back in Germany, Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine seized on Rommel's victories. Here was a general who looked the part: handsome, charismatic, brave. A man who visited his troops, who shared their hardships, who embodied the image of the fearless warrior leader. Rommel became the face of German military success. His image appeared on newsreels, in newspapers, in propaganda films. School children learned his name. German families spoke of him with pride. He was not a distant aristocrat giving orders from a chateau. He was a soldier's general, and the German people loved him for it. Hitler understood Rommel's value not just as a military commander, but as a symbol. He personally awarded Rommel Field Marshal rank, the youngest in the German military. He invited him to his headquarters. He used Rommel's fame to bolster support for the war effort, but there was something crucial about Rommel that set him apart from many in Hitler's inner circle. Rommel was not a Nazi. He was not a member of the party. He did not share Hitler's ideological obsessions. He did not concern himself with racial theories or political purges. Rommel believed in Germany, not the Third Reich. He believed in duty, in military honor, in leading soldiers well and fighting wars according to the rules of combat. His reputation remained largely untainted by the war crimes that stained other German commanders. He refused orders to execute Jewish soldiers and civilians in North Africa. He treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. This distinction mattered to him. And for a time, it didn't matter to Hitler, because Rommel was winning. But wars don't stay won forever. By late 1942, the tide in North Africa began to shift. British forces under Montgomery regrouped and reinforced. American troops landed in Operation Torch. Rommel's supply lines stretched impossibly thin while his enemies grew stronger. At El Alamein, Rommel fought one of the war's pivotal battles and lost. He retreated across North Africa, fighting brilliant defensive actions but ultimately unable to stop the Allied advance. By May 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered. Rommel had already been recalled to Europe, spared the humiliation of captivity, but not the reality of defeat. The legend had limits. And now Hitler needed Rommel for something even more desperate: defending Fortress Europe from the inevitable Allied invasion. Rommel was assigned to inspect and strengthen the Atlantic Wall. The coastal defenses meant to repel any landing in France. He threw himself into the work with his usual energy, building obstacles, laying mines, demanding more troops and resources. But as he toured the defenses, as he read intelligence reports, as he listened to Hitler's increasingly detached strategic directives, something inside Rommel began to shift. For the first time in his career, the Desert Fox started to doubt not just the battle plan, but the war itself. By 1944, Erwin Rommel had spent his entire adult life as a soldier. He understood orders. He understood hierarchy. He understood that a general's duty was to execute the strategy given to him, not to question the political leadership above. But standing on the beaches of Normandy, staring out at the Atlantic and the inevitable invasion fleet that would eventually appear on the horizon, Rommel understood something else. Germany was going to lose this war. It wasn't a matter of courage or tactics or military brilliance. The mathematics were undeniable. The Allies had more men, more tanks, more planes, more ships, and more industrial capacity than Germany could ever hope to match. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of Soviet offensives. Italy had already surrendered. And soon, the full force of American and British military power would crash onto the French coast. Rommel had built defenses. He had laid millions of mines. He had positioned troops and artillery and done everything a field marshal could do to prepare for the coming storm. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. What made this realization dangerous was not the conclusion itself. Many German officers privately knew the war was lost. What made it dangerous was that Rommel began to say it out loud. In meetings with other commanders, Rommel spoke bluntly about Germany's strategic position. He argued that the war should be ended through negotiation before the entire nation was destroyed. He insisted that continuing to fight would only result in more German deaths and the complete devastation of German cities. These were not the words Hitler wanted to hear, because while Rommel was confronting reality in France, Hitler was descending deeper into fantasy in his headquarters. The Führer still spoke of wonder weapons that would turn the tide. He still drew arrows on maps showing German counteroffensives that existed only in his imagination. He still refused to allow any retreat, any shortening of defensive lines, any acknowledgement that Germany might actually lose. And he surrounded himself with men who told him what he wanted to hear. Rommel was not one of those men. When D-Day finally came on June 6, 1944, Rommel had been away from his command, visiting his wife for her birthday, ironically, because the weather had seemed too poor for an invasion. By the time he returned, Allied forces were already ashore, and the battle for France had begun. Rommel fought brilliantly with the forces he had, but brilliant tactics couldn't overcome the fundamental imbalance. For every Allied plane the Germans shot down, 10 more appeared. For every tank destroyed, 20 more rolled off the landing ships. Rommel sent desperate messages to Hitler's headquarters. Send reinforcements, allow tactical withdrawals, permit commanders to make decisions without waiting for approval from hundreds of miles away. Hitler's response was predictable. Hold every inch of ground. No retreat, victory, or death. It was military madness dressed up as determination. And Rommel had seen this pattern before, in North Africa, where Hitler had forbidden retreat even when staying meant certain capture. Now Hitler was applying the same failed logic to France, sacrificing German soldiers not for strategic gain, but for psychological refusal to accept reality. This is when Rommel crossed a line that, in Nazi Germany, was almost impossible to come back from. He began speaking not just to military commanders, but to other officers about the political situation, about the need for Germany to end the war, about the possibility of negotiating with the Western Allies separately from the Soviets, about removing Hitler from power if necessary to save Germany. Rommel never said he would personally assassinate Hitler, but he was talking to people who were. Throughout the German military and government, a resistance network had formed, officers, politicians, and officials who saw the same reality Rommel did and were willing to act. Some wanted to arrest Hitler. Others were planning something more final. Rommel knew of these discussions. Some conspirators approached him directly, hoping the famous Desert Fox would lend his prestige to their cause. Rommel's exact involvement has been debated by historians. But one thing is certain. He knew something was being planned, and he did not report it. In Hitler's Germany, that was enough. Because by mid-1944, Hitler trusted almost no one. The defeats on every front had made him paranoid and isolated. He saw betrayal everywhere, in every general who suggested retreat, in every official who questioned his orders, in every commander whose popularity might rival his own. And Rommel's popularity was immense. The German people still saw him as a hero. Soldiers still spoke of him with admiration. His reputation remained largely intact even as Germany crumbled. This made him dangerous in a way that terrified the regime. If Rommel publicly broke with Hitler, if he called for an end to the war, if he lent his voice to peace negotiations, millions of Germans might listen. The regime's grip on power, built on propaganda, fear, and the myth of inevitable victory, might shatter. Rommel had become what totalitarian leaders fear most, a popular figure they could not fully control. On July 17, 1944, Rommel's staff car was attacked by Allied fighter planes on a French road. He suffered serious head injuries and was evacuated back to Germany to recover at his home in Herrlingen. 3 days later, on July 20th, a bomb exploded in a conference room at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The target? Adolf Hitler himself. The result? Hitler survived, and the purge began. The bomb that was supposed to kill Adolf Hitler failed by minutes and inches. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg had placed a briefcase containing explosives under the conference table at Hitler's East Prussia headquarters, then left the room. The blast killed 4 people and wounded several others. Hitler survived with minor injuries, burst eardrums, burns, and shock, but alive, and absolutely furious. What followed was not justice. It was vengeance disguised as investigation. Within hours, the Gestapo began rounding up anyone connected to the conspiracy. Stauffenberg was executed that same night, shot in a courtyard by firing squad. But Hitler wanted more than the immediate plotters. He wanted everyone. Anyone who had doubted him. Anyone who had questioned his strategy. Anyone whose loyalty seemed less than absolute. The failed assassination became the excuse Hitler needed to purge the German military and government of anyone he considered insufficiently devoted. Thousands were arrested. Interrogations were brutal. Confessions were extracted through torture. The Gestapo created lists of suspects based not on evidence, but on association, suspicion, and denunciation. If you had spoken to a plotter, you were suspect. If you had expressed doubts about the war, you were suspect. If someone under interrogation mentioned your name, you were suspect. The regime established the People's Court under the fanatical Nazi judge Roland Freisler. A kangaroo court designed not to determine guilt, but to humiliate and condemn. Accused officers were dragged before Freisler in civilian clothes, denied lawyers, shouted down when they tried to speak, and sentenced to death in proceedings that mocked any pretense of justice. Many were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, their executions filmed for Hitler to watch. This was the atmosphere in Germany in the weeks following July 20th, 1944. Terror, paranoia, a regime eating itself from within. And in the midst of this purge, during interrogations of conspirators and examination of seized documents, a name kept surfacing. A name that made the Nazi leadership nervous in a way that other suspects did not. Erwin Rommel. The evidence was circumstantial. Some conspirators had mentioned approaching Rommel about joining the resistance. Others had spoken of Rommel's willingness to consider ending the war. One officer under interrogation claimed Rommel had agreed to support a new government after Hitler was removed. But there was no proof that Rommel had known about the assassination plot itself. No documents signed by him. No testimony that he had explicitly agreed to kill Hitler. Nothing concrete that would stand up even in a legitimate court, let alone in the propaganda show trials the regime was staging. Under normal circumstances, this lack of evidence might have saved him. But these were not normal circumstances, and Rommel was not a normal suspect. The problem, for Hitler, was not what Rommel had done. The problem was what Rommel represented. He was Germany's most famous living general, a man whose face had appeared in newspapers and newsreels for years, a commander whose name was known in every German household, a military hero whose reputation transcended the regime itself. If Hitler arrested Rommel publicly and put him on trial, several things would happen, none of them good for the Nazi leadership. First, Rommel might speak. In court, even in Freisler's circus of a courtroom, Rommel could say what he had been saying privately, that the war was lost, that Germany was being destroyed, that continuing to fight was madness. Those words, coming from the Desert Fox, might resonate with the German people in a way that no amount of propaganda could counter. Second, Rommel's arrest would signal to the German military that even their most celebrated commanders were not safe. If the regime could destroy Rommel, it could destroy anyone. This might break what remained of officer corps morale at the exact moment when Germany desperately needed its military to keep fighting. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Rommel's popularity meant that putting him on trial risked turning him into a martyr. The German people might not care about the fates of unknown colonels or staff officers. But Rommel, the man they had been told for years was Germany's greatest warrior, his public humiliation and execution might do more damage to the regime's legitimacy than the bomb itself had done. Hitler understood all of this. He was many things. But he was not stupid about political optics. The regime had spent years building Rommel into a propaganda icon. They could not now destroy that icon without destroying part of their own mythology. But Hitler also could not let Rommel live. Not with his doubts about the war. Not with his dangerous popularity. Not with his name appearing in interrogation transcripts. Rommel had to die. But it had to look like something else. So Hitler made a decision that was as calculated as it was cruel. He would not arrest Rommel. He would not put him on trial. He would not execute him as a traitor. Instead, he would give Rommel a choice that was not really a choice at all. He would force Germany's greatest general to kill himself, and then use his death as one final piece of propaganda. On October 12, 1944, Hitler authorized the mission. Two generals, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Mazel, were selected to deliver the message. They were given their orders, provided with cyanide capsules, and told exactly what to tell Rommel. They departed for Herrlingen on October 14th. Rommel, still recovering from his head injuries at home, had no idea what was coming. October 14th, 1944, began like any other morning at the Rommel home in Herrlingen. Erwin Rommel was still recovering from the head injuries he had sustained in France nearly 3 months earlier. The wounds had been serious. A fractured skull, damage to his left eye and temple, lingering effects that still caused him pain and fatigue. But he was healing. He spent his days reading, writing, walking in the garden with his wife Lucy. His son Manfred, now 15, was home from school. The household maintained a routine that felt almost normal. A brief respite from the chaos of the war that was consuming Germany on every front. Rommel had no reason to expect this day would be different. Until, around noon, a staff car pulled up to the villa. Two generals emerged. Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's chief adjutant, and Ernst Mazel, a general from the personnel office. Both were in full uniform. Both wore expressions that suggested this was not a social visit. Rommel met them in his study. What happened next has been reconstructed from the accounts of Rommel's family, particularly his son Manfred, who was in the house that day. The generals themselves left no detailed record. They were not there to document history. They were there to execute orders. Burgdorf did most of the talking. He was calm, professional, almost bureaucratic in his delivery, as if he were discussing troop assignments rather than a death sentence. He told Rommel that his name had come up during the investigations following the July 20th assassination attempt. That testimony from conspirators had implicated him. that he was suspected of knowing about the plot and possibly supporting it. Rommel protested. He had been in France during the planning. He had been in a hospital when the bomb went off. He had never agreed to assassinate Hitler. Bergdorf acknowledged this. There was, he admitted, no concrete proof of Rommel's direct involvement in the assassination plot itself. But proof, he made clear, was no longer the issue. Then Bergdorf delivered Hitler's message, the real reason they had come. Rommel had two options. Option 1, he could take a cyanide capsule immediately, right here, right now, or within the hour. If he chose this, his death would be attributed to his war injuries, the head trauma from the Allied attack in France. His family would be left alone. His staff would be protected. His name and reputation would remain intact. He would receive a state funeral with full military honors. The German people would mourn him as a hero. His son would inherit his rank and pension rights. Option 2, he could refuse the capsule. In that case, he would be arrested immediately and transported to Berlin to stand trial before the People's Court. The outcome of such a trial was already determined. He would be found guilty. He would be executed as a traitor, likely hanged. His death would be public and humiliating. His family would be arrested. His wife would likely be sent to a concentration camp. His son would bear the stigma of being the child of a traitor. His reputation would be destroyed. His name would be erased from German history, turned into a symbol of betrayal. Bergdorf delivered these options in the same measured tone one might use to explain military logistics. This was not a negotiation. This was not a legal proceeding. This was not even really a choice. It was an execution dressed up as mercy. Hitler was not offering Rommel a way out. He was controlling the manner of his death and weaponizing it for propaganda purposes. If Rommel died honorably, the regime could maintain the myth. The German people would never know their hero had doubted the war. The military would see that even legends serve the Führer unto death. But if Rommel refused and forced a trial, Hitler would publicly destroy him as an example to anyone else who might consider resistance. Either way, Rommel would die. The only question was, what would happen to everyone he loved? Rommel sat in silence for a moment, processing what he had just been told. His face, according to later accounts, showed no panic, only a terrible, settling realization. He was a military man. He understood tactics and strategy, and he understood that he had been placed in a position where there was no tactical solution, no strategic maneuver, no brilliant Desert Fox gambit that could change the outcome. Hitler had trapped him completely. If Rommel chose the capsule, he validated the regime's power to murder its own heroes while maintaining the illusion of loyalty. He became complicit in his own propaganda burial. But if he refused, everyone he loved would pay the price. His wife, who had stood by him through decades of military service. His son, who had his whole life ahead of him. His staff officers and aides, many of whom had served with him for years. All of them would suffer for his resistance. This was not about law or justice or even guilt. This was about power. Absolute, suffocating power that left no room for defiance. Rommel looked at the two generals sitting across from him in his own study, in his own home, in the place where he had thought he was safe. Then he spoke the only words that mattered in that moment. "May I have a few minutes to speak with my family?" Bergdorf and Maisel agreed. But Rommel knew, and they knew, that there was only one choice he could make. Rommel walked upstairs to find his wife, Lucy. She knew immediately that something was wrong. After 28 years of marriage, After watching her husband command armies and survive battlefields across 2 world wars, she could read his face better than anyone. He told her plainly, Hitler had sent the generals to give him a choice between suicide and a show trial. There was no third option, no appeal, no escape. Lucy's world collapsed in that moment. But Rommel had to keep moving. There wasn't time for the grief they both felt. He had minutes, not hours. He found his son, Manfred, 15 years old, in another room. What do you say to your child when you have been ordered to die? How do you explain that the country you served, the system you supported, the leader you followed, has now turned on you with such calculated cruelty that even your family's survival depends on your obedience? Rommel sat down with his son and spoke the words that would haunt Manfred for the rest of his life. In a quarter of an hour, I shall be dead. Manfred didn't understand at first. His father had been recovering. He was getting better. Why would he die? Rommel explained what the generals had told him. The accusations, the ultimatum, the 2 choices that were really only one. Manfred, young and desperate, asked if they could fight back. There were loyal soldiers nearby, officers who served under his father, men who would defend the house if ordered to. Rommel looked at his son with the same tactical clarity he had brought to every battlefield. He explained that SS units were already surrounding the area. He had seen them positioning themselves while the generals were delivering their message. Snipers were in place. Soldiers were stationed at every approach. This was not an arrest that could be resisted. This was a military operation. If they fought, Rommel would still die. But so would others. His staff, perhaps even his family in the crossfire. And afterward, the regime would show no mercy. Lucy would be sent to a camp. Manfred would be imprisoned or worse. It's better that one should die than for all of us to be killed in a shooting affray, Rommel told his son. This was the arithmetic of tyranny. The regime had made one man's life the price of many others' survival. And Rommel, the military strategist who had spent his career calculating costs and outcomes, knew there was no tactical solution that saved everyone. He could only choose how many people would die today. Manfred was crying. Lucy was trying to hold herself together. The house that had been a refuge, a place of recovery and family, had been invaded by a terror that made battlefield dangers seem almost clean by comparison. In war, you know who the enemy is. You can see them across the field, behind their lines, in their uniforms. But this was the regime's hand reaching into your own home, into your family, and demanding death while calling it honor. Rommel had perhaps 10 minutes left. He spent them the only way he could, saying goodbye. He held his wife. He embraced his son. He tried to give them some reassurance that they would be safe, that the regime would keep its word, that his choice would protect them. But even Rommel, the man who had faced down British tanks and survived the North African desert, could not hide the weight of what was happening. He was not going to a battlefield. He was not fighting an enemy army. He was walking to his death because refusing would mean watching everyone he loved destroyed. This was not the death of a soldier. This was the death of a hostage. Then, with whatever time remained, Rommel did something that speaks to the strange formality that pervaded even this horror. He went to his room and put on his uniform. Not a casual jacket, not civilian clothes. His full Afrika Korps uniform, the same uniform he had worn in North Africa. The same uniform that had appeared in countless propaganda photos. The symbol of everything he had been to Germany. If he was going to die, he would die as a soldier. Even if his own nation had betrayed him. Even if the regime was forcing him to execute himself. even if this entire grotesque ceremony was designed to maintain a lie. He buttoned his tunic with steady hands. He adjusted his collar. He looked in the mirror one final time. Not at a field marshal preparing for battle, but at a man preparing for murder, disguised as duty. When he came back downstairs, Lucy and Manfred were waiting. There were no more words that could change anything. No protests that would matter. No prayers that would be answered. Rommel shook hands with his son, a formal military gesture that carried everything he couldn't say. He kissed his wife goodbye. Then he walked to the door where Generals Bergdorf and Maisel were waiting. The staff car was already running outside. Rommel had spent his entire career commanding soldiers, making life-and-death decisions, sending men into battle knowing some would not return. But he had never had to command himself to walk calmly toward his own execution while his family watched. He stepped out of his home for the last time. The door closed behind him. And the Desert Fox walked toward the car that would take him to that quiet country road, where Hitler's final message would be delivered not in words, but in poison. The staff car pulled away from the villa with 3 men inside. Rommel sat in the back seat. Generals Bergdorf and Maisel accompanied him. An SS driver sat behind the wheel, following a route that had been planned in advance. No one spoke. What was there to say? The drive was short, barely 5 minutes from Rommel's home. Just far enough to be out of sight of the villa. Just far enough that his family wouldn't see what happened next. Inside the car, Rommel must have felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Every battle won and lost. Every order followed. Every time he had set aside his doubts in the name of duty. He had survived countless engagements where death seemed certain. Machine gun fire in World War I. Tank battles in France. The brutal campaigns across North Africa where he had been outnumbered, outgunned, but never outthought. He had lived through all of that. And now he would die on a quiet road in the German countryside. Killed not by an enemy, but by the government he had served with distinction for over 3 decades. The car slowed as it approached a secluded stretch of road, wooded on both sides, empty of traffic, a place where no one would witness what was about to happen. The driver pulled to a stop. This was the location that had been chosen. The spot where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel would cease to exist. General Maisel opened his door and stepped out of the vehicle. The SS driver followed, leaving his position behind the wheel. Both men walked a short distance away, far enough to give the appearance of privacy, close enough to respond if called. Inside the car, only Bergdorf and Rommel remained. Bergdorf handed Rommel the cyanide capsule. This small object, no larger than a pill, represented Hitler's final command. The Führer's will made physical, the ultimate expression of absolute power. The ability to order a man to kill himself and know that he would comply. What passed between Bergdorf and Rommel in those final moments has never been fully documented. Bergdorf gave no detailed testimony after the war. He committed suicide in Hitler's bunker in April 1945, as the Reich collapsed around him. What we know comes from fragments, from the movements observed by Maisel and the driver, from the timing, from what came after. We know Rommel sat in that car holding the capsule. We know he understood that biting down on it would cause rapid unconsciousness, followed by death within minutes. Cyanide disrupts the body's ability to use oxygen, causing suffocation at the cellular level even while breathing continues. We know he had no illusions about what was happening. This was not an honorable death. This was not a soldier's sacrifice. This was an execution where the victim was forced to be the executioner. But we don't know his final words. Did he curse Hitler? Did he pray? Did he maintain the stoic silence that had defined his military bearing? Did he think of his family? His wife watching from the window? His son trying to understand why his father wouldn't fight? Did he think of the soldiers who had served under him, who had trusted him, who had believed in the legend of the desert fox? Or did he simply accept what he could not change and do what he had done his entire life, follow orders, even when those orders destroyed him? What we know is this: Rommel bit down on the capsule. The cyanide released into his system. Within seconds, he would have felt the effects: dizziness, difficulty breathing, the rapid onset of unconsciousness. Bergdorf sat next to him, watching a man die according to schedule. There was no struggle, no dramatic final moment, no last-second intervention. Just a general slumping over in the back seat of a staff car on an empty road in Germany, while the trees stood silent and the world continued as if nothing had happened. After a few minutes, when it was clear Rommel was dead, Bergdorf opened his door and stepped out. He signaled to Maisel and the driver. They returned to the vehicle. Maisel looked inside and confirmed what they already knew. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was gone. The driver started the engine. The car began moving again, this time with a corpse in the back seat. A corpse that would soon be transformed into a hero by the same regime that had murdered him. They drove to a military hospital in Ulm, where doctors who had been given their instructions would examine the body and produce the required paperwork. The official cause of death was already written before Rommel took his last breath: complications from war injuries sustained in France. The state funeral was already being planned. The propaganda machine was already preparing its narrative. And back at the villa in Herrlingen, Lucy and Manfred Rommel waited for news they already knew: that the man who had walked out their door 15 minutes ago would never walk back in. The car disappeared down the road. The lie had begun. The official announcement came on October 15th, 1944. One day after Rommel's death, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Germany's celebrated desert fox, had died from complications related to his head injuries sustained during the Allied air attack in Normandy 3 months earlier. The German people heard this news with genuine sorrow. Rommel had been a national hero, a symbol of military excellence, courage, and tactical brilliance. His death was mourned across the country. None of them knew they were mourning a murder. The doctors at the military hospital in Ulm who examined Rommel's body knew the truth. They could see the telltale signs of cyanide poisoning: the characteristic discoloration, the smell, the physical evidence that this was not a death from war injuries. But they wrote what they were told to write. They signed the false medical reports. They listed complications from cranial trauma as the cause of death. They became accomplices in a lie, because refusing meant joining Rommel in an early grave. This is how dictatorships work. They don't just kill people. They force everyone around the victim to participate in the cover-up. They spread the complicity so widely that the truth becomes dangerous for everyone who knows it. Hitler himself ordered a state funeral. Not out of respect. Hitler had just forced Rommel to commit suicide, but out of propaganda necessity. The regime still needed the myth of Rommel more than they needed the truth about his death. Germany was losing on every front. Allied forces were pushing into German territory from the west. Soviet armies were crushing German defenses in the east. The Nazi leadership needed symbols of strength, not stories of internal purges and forced suicides. So they gave Rommel the funeral of a hero. On October 18th, 1944, 4 days after his murder, the ceremony took place in Ulm City Hall. Thousands attended. Nazi banners hung from buildings. Military bands played solemn music. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most senior officers, delivered the eulogy. He stood before Rommel's flag-draped coffin and spoke of the great general's service to Germany, his tactical genius, his devotion to duty. He did not mention that Rommel had questioned the war. He did not mention the suspicions of disloyalty. He certainly did not mention that Hitler had ordered Rommel to kill himself just days earlier. Instead, Rundstedt called Rommel's death a merciful release from his injuries, a phrase that was technically true in the most twisted possible way. The regime had shown Rommel mercy. If you could call forcing a man to poison himself to protect his family mercy. Hitler sent a personal letter of condolence to Lucy Rommel. He praised her husband's service. He expressed his sorrow at Germany's loss. The same man who had authorized her husband's execution now offered his sympathies to his widow. Lucy Rommel stood at the funeral knowing the truth, forced to accept condolences from the very people who had murdered her husband. She had to play the role of the grieving war widow, while Hitler's representatives praised the general their Führer had destroyed. Manfred Rommel, just 15 years old, stood beside his mother in his Hitler Youth uniform, part of the grotesque theater the regime had constructed. The son of a man killed for insufficient loyalty, dressed in the uniform of the organization devoted to Hitler. He couldn't speak the truth. His mother couldn't reveal what had happened. The entire family had to participate in the lie because that was the condition of their survival. This was the final cruelty. Rommel's family had to help bury the truth with his body. The propaganda machine worked over time. Newspapers published tributes to Rommel's military genius. Radio broadcasts told stories of his campaigns. His image appeared in memorial services across Germany. The regime that had murdered him was now using his death to inspire continued loyalty to the system that had killed him. Rommel's grave became a site of pilgrimage for Germans who believed they were honoring a fallen hero. They left flowers and wreaths. They spoke his name with reverence. None of them knew they were mourning at the grave of a man their own government had assassinated. The truth was buried so effectively that even within the German military, most officers believed Rommel had died from his war injuries. The few who suspected otherwise knew better than to speak up. Rommel's fate was proof of what happened to those who questioned too loudly. For months, the lie held. The Desert Fox was dead. But his legend served the Reich one final time, as propaganda for a regime in its death throes. The state funeral was perfect propaganda. Tragedy without blame, loss without accountability, sacrifice without truth. But propaganda, like all lies built on murder, cannot survive forever. Eventually, witnesses speak. Documents surface. The machinery of deception breaks down under the weight of its own contradictions. And when Germany finally collapsed in May 1945, when Allied forces occupied the country, when Nazi officials were captured and interrogated, when the full scope of the regime's crimes began to emerge, the truth about Erwin Rommel's death began to surface as well. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the full machinery of the Nazi regime lay exposed. Allied investigators combed through documents. They interrogated surviving officials. They pieced together the truth about thousands of crimes that had been hidden behind propaganda and lies. And among those truths was the real story of how Erwin Rommel died. Manfred Rommel, no longer a boy forced into silence, finally spoke publicly about what had happened on October 14, 1944. He described the two generals arriving at their home. He recounted his father's words, "I will be dead within 15 minutes." He explained the ultimatum, the forced choice, the SS units surrounding the villa. Other witnesses came forward. Officers who had suspected the truth but couldn't speak during the war now provided testimony. Documents were uncovered showing the regime's involvement in arranging Rommel's suicide. The hero's death had been a murder, The state funeral had been theater. The grief of an entire nation had been manipulated to serve the same regime that had killed their hero. Rommel's grave in Herrlingen, once visited by those who believed they were honoring a fallen warrior, became something more complex. A place of reflection on loyalty, conscience, and the terrible cost of serving tyranny. People still come to that roadside memorial today, but they come with different questions than the mourners of 1944. They come asking, what do you do when your country demands loyalty, but your conscience demands resistance? They come wondering, at what point does duty become complicity? They come confronting, can you serve an evil regime while maintaining your own morality? Rommel's story offers no easy answers to these questions, and that's precisely why it matters. Because Rommel was not a simple hero. He was not a clear villain. He existed in the moral complexity that most of history occupies, but that propaganda tries to erase. Yes, he served the Nazi regime. Yes, his military brilliance helped Germany prosecute a war of aggression. Yes, his fame was used to legitimize a government responsible for genocide and atrocity. But he also questioned that regime when others remained silent. He protected prisoners when others executed them. He came to see the war's futility when others clung to delusion. And he paid for that evolution with his life. The myth of the good general in a bad regime is complicated. Rommel's relative decency, his refusal to commit war crimes, his treatment of prisoners, his personal honor, does not absolve him of serving a monstrous system. But neither does his service to that system erase the moral courage it took to speak truth to power when doing so meant death. Modern historians have reassessed Rommel's legacy with more nuance than either the Nazi propaganda or the Allied mythology allowed. He was neither the perfect knight that German propaganda portrayed, nor the good Nazi that some post-war narratives tried to create. He was a man who made choices, some brave, some naive, some tragic, within a system designed to destroy anyone who questioned it. And the lesson of his death is not about Rommel specifically. It's about what happens when power becomes absolute and loyalty becomes weaponized. Hitler didn't just kill Rommel. He made Rommel kill himself, then used his death to strengthen the very regime that murdered him. That's the ultimate expression of totalitarian power, the ability to turn even a person's death into propaganda for their killer. This pattern didn't end in 1944. Across history and around the world today, we see the same tactics. Dissidents forced into suicide, inconvenient figures who die in accidents, popular leaders who disappear while official stories claim natural causes. Rommel's story reminds us to question official narratives, especially when they're too convenient, too clean, too perfectly aligned with a regime's propaganda needs. It reminds us that loyalty to a nation is not the same as loyalty to its government, and that the two can come into devastating conflict. It shows us that popularity offers no protection in dictatorships. If anything, it makes you more dangerous. Hitler destroyed Rommel precisely because he was loved, because his voice might have mattered, because his dissent might have inspired others. And it teaches us that silence has a cost, not just for those who speak up and die, but for those who stay silent and live. Because the doctors who falsified Rommel's death certificate lived. The generals who delivered Hitler's ultimatum lived. The officials who arranged the false funeral lived. But they lived as accomplices to murder. They lived knowing they had helped bury the truth. They lived with the knowledge that their silence had made tyranny possible. Today, that quiet road near Herrlingen where Rommel died looks like any other country road in Germany. Cars pass by, trees stand, birds sing, but that road remembers what many have forgotten: That even legends can be erased when power goes unchecked. That even heroes can be forced to become participants in their own destruction. That even the most celebrated figures can die in silence when speaking becomes too dangerous. The memorial stone at that location tells part of the story. But the full truth is harder and more important than any inscription can capture. On a quiet road in Germany, a war hero died without a battle, not because he lost faith in his country, but because his leader lost faith in him. And that is what Hitler told Rommel, without ever speaking to him at all. What Hitler's final message really said was this: in a dictatorship, loyalty offers no protection, conscience offers no defense, and popularity makes you not powerful, but expendable. Rommel learned that truth in the last 15 minutes of his life. The question for us is whether we'll remember it, or whether we'll need to learn it again ourselves. If you find this kind of forgotten courage as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of defiance and sacrifice deserve to be told. And by subscribing, you help ensure they aren't forgotten.